when a mysterious love letter surfaces in the pocket of a man found dead beneath a rose arbor, whispers stir through the village of St. Mary Mead, and only Miss Marple can trace the secrets blooming where no one thought to look. Welcome, dear listener. Where are you joining us from today? What time is it for you now? Perhaps evening, with the kettle just off the boil. How has your day been so far? Peaceful, or touched by something peculiar? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from you, and it helps others discover these mysteries too. Now, find something warm to sip, get comfortable, and let's begin. It was a Thursday morning, mild and clear, the kind of English spring day that encouraged a stroll before luncheon and a second cup of tea afterwards. The village of St. Mary Mead had roused itself to the sound of birds and hedge clippers, its lanes swept clean and its windows flung open. And yet, before midday, a note of unease crept across the hedgerows. A whisper, no louder than a breath, passed from one neighbor to the next. Mr. Gilbert Waring had been found dead in his garden, a handsome widower of some reputation, both for his good looks and his extensive, if somewhat theatrical, attentions to the ladies. Mr. Waring had long held a peculiar charm over the women of the village. He was the sort of man who remembered birthdays, not his own, and inquired after one's roses with the delicacy of a botanist. He had lived alone in the house his late wife had once decorated, to such elegant excess, and he had maintained the garden to a fault. Roses, mostly, and a climbing honeysuckle he'd coaxed over the old trellis himself. It was beneath that very trellis, among the scatter of petals and trimmed twine, that his body had been discovered, half-turned as though reaching for something just out of sight. The doctor had been called and arrived in haste. A faint odor lingered. Nothing acrid, nothing alarming, but his conclusion was a quiet one. Heart failure, perhaps, though the man had seemed in perfect health only days before. Yet what changed the nature of the affair, what nudged it from sad to strange, was the discovery of a folded letter in Mr. Waring's jacket pocket. The paper was cream, thick, and unadorned. It bore no address, no signature, no date, but the message was unmistakably personal. I never forgot the kiss beneath the lilac tree. Miss Marple, upon hearing the news from her maid, who had heard it from the greengrocer, who had it from the postman, simply raised her eyebrows and said nothing. But later that day she opened the drawer where she kept her clippings and curiosities, and placed a blank card within it, labelled in her neat script, Mr. Waring, Lilac Kiss. By 4 o'clock the vicarage was a hum of murmurs and polite speculation. The vicar's wife, ever obliging in moments of village disturbance, had set out a tray of shortbread and cucumber sandwiches, and gently suggested that talking it out might prove a balm to communal nerves. The ladies of St. Mary Mead required little encouragement. Mrs. Bantry was first to pronounce her verdict. I always said Gilbert Waring was the sort of man who believed charm could excuse anything, even bad manners, she said, tapping her teaspoon with finality. Though I admit, she added, he never was unkind. Kindness is not the same as goodness, murmured Miss Hartnell, her hat at a militant tilt. And I've never trusted men who smile too much. There were nods, soft ones. All agreed that while Mr. Waring had no documented enemies, he had certainly collected his fair share of disappointments. Disappointed women, that is. Miss Lydia Bell, the new piano teacher with a hesitant smile, had been seen walking with him just a fortnight ago. And hadn't Mrs. Edgecombe been awfully attentive to him at the garden fete? And what of the housekeeper, Mrs. Rudge, who had served him faithfully for 12 years and received little thanks for it? Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, observing rather than contributing. Her eyes moved gently from face to face, noting not what was said but what was not. She listened especially to the silences and to the odd glance exchanged between Mrs. Edgecombe and Miss Price, the seamstress, who sat rather stiffly in the corner. "I dare say it's sad," offered Miss Weatherby, who rarely committed herself to opinion. "A man dying alone in his garden, even with roses about." Miss Marple smiled, just slightly. "Yes, but roses can be awfully misleading things. So lovely in bloom, so terribly thorny beneath." And still, no one had mentioned the letter. Later, as the party began to thin and the light shifted through the window panes, Miss Marple caught sight of the seamstress rising from her chair, her mouth tight, her fingers white around the handle of her bag. And just before she turned to leave, she murmured, not quite to anyone, "Well, she wasn't the last woman he kissed. That's the tragedy." Miss Marple had always believed that certain truths did not need to be shouted. Indeed, in a village like St. Mary Mead, the whisper was often far more revealing than the confession. The words, spoken almost absently by Miss Price, clung to her memory like a thread too stubborn to unpick. She wasn't the last woman he kissed. That implied another, surely. Someone more recent than the one the letter so wistfully referenced. And if so, who? Miss Price herself was not generally given to poetry. She ran a modest alteration shop out of her late father's parlor, and had earned a reputation for precision, discretion, and an unrelenting eye for crooked seams. She had never married, though her younger sister Beatrice had once been the subject of village gossip, long before her untimely passing some 20 years ago. Consumption, they had said, or nerves. The truth, Miss Marple suspected, had always been more complicated. That evening, as she sat in her parlor trimming deadheads from a pot of violets, Miss Marple considered the remark again. It had not been theatrical. It had not even seemed intentional. But its weight lay in its casual cruelty, that someone had kissed Gilbert Waring shortly before his death, and that such a kiss had mattered enough to be called tragic. And then there was the matter of the bruise. Dr. Hayward had mentioned it in passing, a slight discoloration just behind the left ear. Possibly from a fall, he had suggested, or a sudden collapse. But Miss Marple had filed it differently. A fall, yes, but one preceded by surprise or struggle. The village, meanwhile, turned inward as villages do when death knocks too close. Curtains were drawn earlier. Walks were taken in twos, not alone. Lydia Bell did not attend her Friday lessons. Mrs. Edgecombe cancelled her bridge afternoon. And Mrs. Rudge, according to the butcher's boy, seemed especially short-tempered. Miss Marple clipped one final leaf and set down her scissors. She would visit Miss Price soon, not to press her, certainly not to pry. But a hem needed adjusting, and perhaps a seam reinforced, and in such small domestic spaces, truth had a way of slipping between the stitches. There are men whose lives remain curiously untouched by consequence. Men who move through the years with polished shoes, impeccable manners, and a disarming way of speaking to women as though they alone mattered in that moment. Gilbert Waring had been such a man. His widowhood, spoken of with vague sympathy and little precision, had bestowed upon him an air of noble melancholy. He rarely spoke of his late wife, and when he did, it was with such tender restraint that even those who knew of his infidelities during the marriage softened at the edges of their judgment. He was, after all, handsome in that timeless way women secretly forgive. To the unmarried ladies of the village, Mr. Waring represented a kind of hopeful enigma. To the widows, he was proof that a man could survive loss and still inquire after the quality of one's raspberry cordial. He never crossed lines, But he flirted with them, literally and figuratively, his remarks always harmless until they were remembered later, when one was alone and too aware of what had not been said. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had observed the pattern. He sent flowers after missed appointments. He remembered the birthdays of women he never intended to pursue. He knew precisely how to step away before emotional investment could curdle into resentment. But there had been murmurs, subtle as moth wings, whispers that Miss Lydia Bell, the piano teacher recently arrived from London, had been seen entering his house after dusk. And hadn't Mrs. Edgecombe taken to visiting more frequently under the pretext of floral arrangements? Then there was Miss Price, who once stitched a monogram into a handkerchief Mr. Waring had claimed to misplace. A handkerchief he never came back to collect. In St. Mary Mead, a man like that did not lack attention. But attention, Miss Marple knew, was not the same as affection. And affection, when slighted or misunderstood, had a way of curdling into something bitter. Mrs. Bantry had once remarked, in the manner of women who pretend they are not gossiping, when in fact they most certainly are, that Gilbert Waring was a man who made promises in order to feel romantic rather than honorable. It was a clever distinction, Miss Marple had thought, and not inaccurate. Years ago, before her own husband passed, Mrs. Bantry recalled Gilbert taking her hand at the midsummer dance, and speaking of Paris as though it were already arranged. "We must one day see the lilacs along the Seine," he had murmured. "They say they bloom twice as sweet after rain." She had smiled, charmed in the moment, but no invitation came, nor indeed a second reference to Paris. It was this pattern that seemed to trace Gilbert's legacy with the village women. Intimate words spoken in moonlit gardens, walks taken with unnecessary umbrellas, handwritten notes pressed between pages of borrowed books, all gestures that felt like beginnings, but which never quite became anything more. Miss Marple listened to Mrs. Bantry's recollections with her usual gentle silence. Beneath the nostalgia, she detected something more measured. Not regret, but reflection. And yet, when Mrs. Bantry mentioned the time Gilbert had promised Miss Lydia Bell a ring, only to delay and later recant the idea entirely, a sharper note crept in. "She had the look of a girl who had read too many sonnets," Mrs. Bantry had added. "But he made her believe she was the only stanza." Miss Marple folded her hands and said nothing. She thought instead of the note found in his coat, that reference to a kiss beneath the lilac tree. The words bespoke sentiment, yes, but also secrecy. The kind of secrecy born not from affection, but from shame or fear. And when Miss Marple heard that Lydia Bell had not only broken off her lessons, but had sent back the borrowed sheet music in a plain brown envelope, she did not think it was because of sorrow, no. She thought perhaps it was because Lydia had realized, as many had, that Gilbert Waring had never meant to stay. Among those in Mr. Waring's domestic orbit, two figures loomed quietly but with distinct gravity. Mrs. Rudge, the housekeeper of 12 years, and Mr. Malcolm Trent, a cousin by marriage, and a man as lean in temperament as he was in figure. Neither would have considered themselves particularly close to Gilbert Waring, and yet both held positions of proximity that bore the weight of unspoken grievances. Mrs. Rudge, a woman of steady gait and unsmiling service, had served faithfully since Mrs. Waring's passing. She had never been warm, precisely, but her devotion to the household had been absolute. She ran the kitchen and garden accounts with military precision, scoured the Silver Weekly, and kept to a rhythm no one dared disrupt. But there were murmurs, small and often disregarded, that Mrs. Rudge had once adored her mistress beyond the ordinary lines of duty. and though she never spoke ill of Mr. Waring, there were times her silence felt thick with disapproval. Mr. Malcolm Trent, meanwhile, had been named in earlier versions of the Waring will. Not prominently, but enough to matter. A quiet man with thinning hair and an eye for financial ledgers, he had long resented Gilbert's leisurely dependence on inherited funds. Never a man to build, only to enjoy, he had once said at a garden luncheon, only half beneath his breath. Though he seldom visited, Mr. Trent's presence at the vicarage tea had not gone unnoticed. He had asked few questions, but had listened with great care. Miss Marple, who always found the quietly bitter more interesting than the loudly aggrieved, noted the stillness in his expression when the letter was mentioned. Not surprise, something else. Calculation, perhaps, or a memory reawakened. It was curious, she thought, that both these individuals, one within the household, the other at its edge, bore long-standing ties to the late Mr. Waring, and yet, at his sudden death, neither had offered more than a perfunctory nod of sadness. And it was just then, as the gathering dispersed with that particular silence reserved for unresolved deaths, that Miss Marple heard something else. Not words exactly, but a voice carried from across the street. The remark might have passed unnoticed were it not for the quiet into which it had fallen. Miss Lydia Bell, walking alongside Miss Weatherby near the green grocer's awning, had said it softly, almost wistfully, but the tone had not matched the words. "I wasn't the last," she said. "He kissed someone else before he died." Miss Marple had paused beside the post-box, pretending to examine the front of an envelope. The statement had been offered without context, but the implication was clear, and it troubled her. Only days prior, the piano teacher had been the presumed object of Gilbert Waring's romantic attentions. There had been mention of a ring, though no one had seen it, and of long walks, piano duets, and afternoons spent discussing Chopin and the nature of sentiment. Now, however, Lydia's tone had shifted. It carried a weight more resigned than heartbroken, and that, to Miss Marple's mind, was telling. It was not jealousy, she thought, that prompted the remark, nor was it indignation. There was something else in it, an injury of discovery, perhaps, the sense that one had been made to believe in an intimacy that did not, in fact, exist. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made quiet inquiries. She learned that Miss Bell had returned a parcel to Mr. Waring's house on the morning of his death. A parcel containing borrowed sheet music, tied with a green ribbon. Mrs. Rudge had accepted it without comment. What struck Miss Marple as especially odd was the fact that the music had been returned at all. Most young women in Miss Bell's position might have kept it, if only for memory's sake. But Lydia had returned it as one might return a library book, promptly, impersonally, and without affection. The idea that Gilbert Waring had kissed another woman shortly before his death opened a new line of thought. Who had it been? And was it a kiss of affection or of parting? Miss Marple tucked the envelope into her handbag and turned homeward, her mind quietly arranging petals, letters, and shadows. For in the garden of memory, something quite unexpected had begun to bloom. There are certain trees that linger in memory long after their roots have been disturbed. The lilac tree behind the old vicarage had been such a tree. Delicate, fragrant, and the site of many whispered confidences during the war years. Miss Marple, who remembered the time well, had thought of it immediately upon reading the strange note found in Gilbert Waring's coat. "I never forgot the kiss beneath the lilac tree." The tree itself had been felled nearly 20 years ago to make way for a stone wall and a modest shed. Yet, to those who remembered its brief bloom each spring, it had marked a small corner of beauty, and for some, secrecy. Miss Marple considered the note not as poetry, but as confession. To whom had it been written? And more importantly, who had written it? The absence of a name suggested a shared understanding, something unspoken but mutually known. She arranged, quite naturally, to visit Miss Price the following morning. A hem, she said, needed reinforcement. It was a minor matter, but such things in St. Mary Mead often opened unexpected doors. Miss Price welcomed her with a quiet reserve. She was thinner than Miss Marple recalled, her eyes paler, and her manner tinged with a nervous energy. Yet she worked quickly, her fingers still nimble with years of stitching other people's secrets into silence. As she pinned the fabric with care, Miss Marple gently mentioned the old vicarage garden. How it had changed, how the lilac tree had once stood with such gentle defiance. Miss Price paused just briefly before continuing her work. Her reply was soft and distant. It bloomed too early that final year. A hard frost took it before the petals had opened fully. It was an observation without clear purpose, and yet it held meaning, not botanical, but emotional. Miss Marple watched the woman's hands tremble ever so slightly before returning to the rhythm of thread and silence. And in that pause, Miss Marple felt something stir. Memory, perhaps, or guilt, or both. It was during the final pressing of the fabric that Miss Price, without prompt or preamble, spoke again. Not to Miss Marple exactly, but to the room, or perhaps to herself. "My sister Beatrice used to sit beneath that lilac tree," she said. "Always with a book, always waiting for someone who often arrived too late." Miss Marple remained still. She had learned that silence often invited the rest. "She was younger than I, prettier, more hopeful," Miss Price continued, folding the fabric now with unnecessary precision. "People admired her hands, said she ought to have been a pianist, but she wanted something else. She wanted a life like the ones in her novels." There was a pause, then more softly. "And Gilbert Waring made her believe she could have it." The confession was quiet, worn thin by time. Beatrice Price, it seemed, had once shared a romance with Gilbert during the early war years. Clandestine meetings, whispered declarations, the kind of unacknowledged affection that left no photographs and only the faintest rumors. "After he married, she changed," Miss Price said, not bitterly, but with a kind of fatigue. "Moved to London for a time, fell ill, came back thinner. She died not long after. Heart, they said." Miss Marple knew what "they said" often meant. Illness, yes, but also abandonment, disgrace, or grief, too long endured. In villages like theirs, the official version was sometimes just a courtesy. Miss Price lifted her head then, her composure returning like a curtain being drawn. "I doubt Gilbert even remembers. Men forget. They do not mean to. They simply move on, and the rest of us are left gathering up the pieces." Miss Marple said nothing. She did not need to. But in her mind, the shape of the mystery was beginning to shift. The letter in Gilbert's pocket was no longer an abstraction. It was history resurfaced, and with it, the shadow of a woman whose voice had been stilled long before her story had finished being written. And Miss Marple, ever the reader of people, knew this particular tale had not yet revealed its final page. Miss Marple had always considered that women, particularly the younger kind, tended to speak of love as though it were a sequence of meaningful events. First glance, first flower, first promise. Men, she observed, were more inclined to remember the interruptions between those things. It was in the discrepancy between these recollections that misunderstandings often took root. Lydia Bell, still relatively new to St. Mary Mead, and bearing the gentle manners of one who had learned music before marriage, had struck many as genteel, but emotionally fragile. The fact that Gilbert Waring had taken an interest in her was no great surprise. He had always admired softness, particularly when it came with ankle-length skirts and an air of loneliness. It was at the vicarage's monthly music evening that Lydia had first hinted, discreetly and with reddened cheeks, that Mr. Waring had spoken of a future. There had even been mention of a ring. Mrs. Bantry, whose instinct for emotional developments rivaled her gardener's for root rot, later confided to Miss Marple that Lydia had expected a proposal by Easter. But Easter had come and gone, and with it, Gilbert Waring's attentions. Miss Marple learned with little effort that the ring had never been presented, only discussed, and when Miss Bell had asked, as women do when they are tired of ambiguity, Gilbert had become evasive. "A matter of timing," he had said, "of legacy complications. Nothing to worry about." Yet something had clearly shifted. The Sunday following his death, Miss Bell had returned a small gift he had given her, a delicate bracelet, worn only once. She had left it with Mrs. Rudge in an envelope marked simply, "No longer appropriate." Miss Marple did not suspect bitterness in Lydia's actions, but she did detect pain, the kind that comes not from betrayal but from humiliation. A promise withdrawn too swiftly suggests it was never made in good faith, and when made publicly, however discreetly, its revocation left bruises that lingered longer than most. There was, however, another bruise to consider, one found behind Gilbert Waring's left ear, and that was not the sort that came from embarrassment. In the days following any unexpected death, it is the habits of the living that most intrigue the observant mind. While most villagers turned inward, folding their routines like shawls for quiet reflection, Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Edgecombe had become unusually industrious. Though the widow had been among those most frequently seen in Mr. Waring's company, often arriving with cuttings for his garden or some delicacy for his table, she had since kept to herself. When questioned at the vicarage tea, she had said little and departed early, her gloved hands pressed tightly around the handle of her handbag. It was not the withdrawal that interested Miss Marple. Grief takes many forms, but rather what followed 2 days later. While walking along the footpath bordering Mrs. Edgecombe's garden, Miss Marple paused to admire a bed of snapdragons. It was there she noticed a small bonfire, at the back corner, its smoke low and grey, the sort that speaks more of haste than horticulture. Mrs. Edgecombe stood beside it, holding what appeared to be a small pile of envelopes and folded papers. She did not see Miss Marple, who, rather than interrupting, continued her stroll with the appearance of indifference. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple learned from young Thomas, the paper boy, that he had delivered a letter addressed to Mrs. Edgecombe the very morning of the fire, postmarked from London, with no return name. He had thought little of it until now. The village postmistress, when questioned in a manner so gentle it felt more like conversation than inquiry, recalled that Mrs. Edgecombe occasionally received letters from a solicitor, always discreetly marked and always destroyed shortly thereafter. Miss Marple pondered this with care. A solicitor's letter might refer to a will, or a settlement, or, more tantalizingly, a change of intention regarding either. It was not so much the burning of the letter that intrigued her, but the timing of it. Why would a woman burn correspondence so soon after the death of a man she had once been so attentive toward? Unless, of course, the letter revealed something she did not wish anyone else to read. The official verdict had, until now, remained tactfully inconclusive. Cardiac arrest, the term employed by Dr. Hayward, was sufficiently vague to satisfy those uninterested in complication, and sufficiently serious to excuse any lack of further questioning. But medicine, Miss Marple knew, rarely offers simplicity, particularly in a case that did not quite feel like a natural end. It was on the Monday morning following the funeral that Dr. Hayward, having completed a more thorough examination than originally deemed necessary, made a discreet call to the vicar. It was not protocol precisely, but in St. Mary Mead, certain deviations from formality could be excused for the sake of discretion, especially when they involved substances not commonly found in the garden shed. Gilbert Waring, it transpired, had died from an overdose of digitalis, a potent derivative of the foxglove plant, and used in controlled doses to treat certain heart conditions. In excess, it slowed the heart to a fatal rhythm. What made the matter more curious was the complete absence of any prescription. Gilbert had never, to Dr. Hayward's knowledge, suffered from heart troubles, nor had he ever been seen at the surgery requesting such medication. The implications were clear. If the drug had not been prescribed to Mr. Waring, and if he had no known condition requiring it, then it must have been administered by other means, intentionally or otherwise. The doctor would not speculate aloud, but Miss Marple had known him long enough to recognize the tone in which he refrained from doing so. She asked only one question. Could the digitalis have been introduced through drink? Yes, came the answer. Most likely. Wine or tea. It would dissolve easily and leave no taste strong enough to detect. Not if taken with something sweet. Miss Marple thought of the wine Gilbert was known to sip at twilight, the sugar he took in his morning tea, and the housekeeper who prepared both. But she said none of it aloud. Instead, she folded the knowledge away, placing it with the others. The letter, the lilac, the kiss, and now the poison. It was not a fall that had bruised Gilbert Waring. It had been something far more deliberate. News, when it arrives in St. Mary Mead, travels not by proclamation but by murmur, and though the details of Dr. Hayward's findings had not been formally shared beyond the vicar's parlour, the effect was swift and unmistakable. Miss Marple, seated beside the window of her modest sitting room, observed the shifting rhythms of the village with a quiet attentiveness sharpened by years of such watching. Faces turned more quickly from one another. Conversations paused when certain names were mentioned. Mrs. Weatherby adjusted her morning walk so as not to pass the Waring property, and the butcher's apprentice reported that Mrs. Rudge now collected her meat with curt nods and exact coin, saying no more than necessary. But it was within the confines of the vicarage, where a small number of close acquaintances had gathered to reminisce and, in more practical terms, divide what few things Gilbert had left behind, that the true texture of reaction could be felt. Lydia Bell, whose face had lately acquired a pale firmness, fainted quietly when the doctor's findings were mentioned. Not in the manner of one overcome by shock, but rather as if the world had shifted, and she could no longer trust its footing. Mrs. Edgecombe rose abruptly and excused herself, her tea left untouched and her gloves clutched too tightly in her hand. She offered no condolences, only a vague comment about the unreliability of men who drank too much. Miss Price, sitting at the edge of the group with her embroidery untouched, looked as though she had not heard at all, though Miss Marple noticed she had stopped stitching precisely at the moment the word poison was first spoken. Mr. Malcolm Trent, ever silent and watchful, inquired dryly whether an inquest would be necessary. Miss Marple caught the faintest flicker in his expression. Not fear precisely, but annoyance. The kind of reaction one offers when a conclusion has been delayed, not derailed. And through it all, Miss Marple remained still, her attention drifting not to the loud, but to the subtle, The unzipped tea, the misplaced glove, the thread still caught in Miss Price's needle. Murder, if that it was, rarely announced itself in grand gestures. It preferred quiet corners, and those, Miss Marple knew, were always the most revealing. In the matter of poisons, Miss Marple had long noted that murderers seldom think like chemists. They think like people in pain, in fear, or in anger, and only afterwards begin to tidy up behind themselves. It was not the poison itself that solved cases, she believed, but the trail left by the assumptions surrounding it. And so it came as little surprise when it was quietly revealed that a bottle of digitalis, the same substance found in Gilbert Waring's bloodstream, had gone missing from the personal medicine chest of Mr. Malcolm Trent. The matter was disclosed somewhat grudgingly during a meeting between the vicar and Dr. Hayward, both of whom had been attempting to construct a time frame for the administration of the fatal dose. Mr. Trent, ever the pragmatist, had admitted that he had kept a small reserve of the medication in his study drawer, having been prescribed it years ago for a brief heart irregularity. He no longer took it, but, in his words, preferred to have it on hand, should the need arise. When asked how long it had been missing, he replied that he hadn't checked the drawer in several weeks and had assumed the bottle still lay undisturbed beneath his blotter. Only upon hearing of Gilbert's death had he thought to look, and found it gone. To some this admission might have carried a whiff of guilt. But Miss Marple's mind worked differently. She recalled with great clarity how Mr. Trent had reacted upon hearing of the poison, not with alarm, but irritation. It was not the horror of discovery, but the inconvenience of involvement that had crept across his face. She considered what it would mean for a man like Trent. Methodical, restrained, economically minded, to kill. It did not suit him. He was the type to endure slights and document them rather than act on impulse. But still, the medicine had gone missing under his roof. The question was not merely who had taken it, but who had known it was there. And as Miss Marple pondered this, a fresh clue emerged, not clinical but botanical, tucked within a place only someone sentimental would ever think to hide. The lockbox had been overlooked at first, a narrow brass-latched container discovered by the gardener behind a loose brick in the rear garden wall. It was the sort of thing one might use to store a photograph or a keepsake, forgotten long ago behind ivy and stone. Yet within it lay not money or papers, but a single dried blossom, fragile, pale, unmistakably lilac. Miss Marple regarded it with unusual intensity. The flower was pressed carefully between a folded slip of linen, the kind used for handkerchiefs, with just enough yellowing to suggest it had rested there for decades, and with it, a photograph. A young woman in a nurse's uniform, unsmiling, eyes turned to the left as though listening to something beyond the frame. On the back, in faint pencil, to G, with all my heart. L. The G was easy to interpret, but the L required greater care. It was not Miss Lydia Bell. Of that Miss Marple was confident. The uniform and style of the portrait were from a different time entirely. No, this belonged to another generation, one now silent. And yet, the flower told more than the inscription. Lilac trees, she knew, did not bloom in St. Mary Mead during that year, at least not after the frost that had blackened the early buds. Miss Price herself had said so, which meant the blossom had come from a different year, perhaps a different place, but had been kept, with deliberate care, by someone who remembered. There had long been whispers in the village, too soft to call rumors, of a child born out of place during the war. A girl taken in by relations, no official adoption, just quiet adjustments and kindly half-truths. the kind of story a small village chose not to confirm but never quite forgot. Miss Marple, who had once catalogued family resemblances for an entire generation of church pews, began to rearrange the pieces: the photograph, the blossom, the initial, the memory that refused to fade. If the child had indeed been born, and the mother had been the woman in the photograph, then the implications for Gilbert Waring's past, and for the identity of the woman who had written the letter in his pocket, were far more consequential than anyone had yet realized. And in the lingering scent of that long-dried lilac, Miss Marple sensed the presence of a truth still clinging to life. The photograph had been faded by time, its edges foxed, and its subject captured in that particular wartime stillness, formal, composed, and faintly wistful. There was nothing unusual in a nurse's portrait, not during those years. Countless young women had sat before such lenses, their uniforms stiffly ironed, their expressions resigned to duty. But Miss Marple, who had known the Price sisters in their youth and had an almost forensic memory for facial structure, could not mistake the slope of the chin, the long upper lip, or the peculiar intensity of the gaze. Beatrice Price, there could be no doubt. She had been one of those girls whose beauty announced itself softly. Not with glamour, but with the sort of presence that made a room lean subtly in her direction. While her elder sister, Miss Price, remained cloaked in domestic habit and the dignity of independence, Beatrice had once spoken of cities, causes, and, quite against her family's preferences, a commission to serve during the war. Her death, when it came, had been as muted as her departure. An illness, it was said. But there had always been something unfinished in the way people spoke of her, a gap between the story offered and the truth withheld. Now, holding the photograph beside the dried lilac, Miss Marple considered the inscription once more. To G, with all my heart. There was no surname, of course, just the letter, the uniform, the flower, and the memory. She could picture it, Beatrice seated beneath the old lilac tree, waiting. Gilbert Waring, younger then, ambitious in charm and careless with hearts, promising something he never intended to honor. And yet, somewhere in the course of things, affection had passed between them, sufficient at least for a photograph to be given, and a token blossom preserved. Miss Marple placed the photo into a folder lined with tissue. She had no desire to confront Miss Price prematurely. No. There was a rhythm to these things, and truth, like the lilac, bloomed best when not forced. Still, if the photograph belonged to Beatrice, and Beatrice had once belonged to Gilbert, then the question remained: what legacy had been left unspoken? It was not accusation that prompted Miss Marple's return to the seamstress's parlor, but a quiet sense of inevitability. Threads, once pulled far enough, must either break or reveal the shape they were intended to bind. Miss Marple, in her gentle way, believed in the latter. Miss Price had not expected a second visit. Her fingers fumbled slightly at the sight of Miss Marple's familiar cardigan and gloves, and for a moment she stood as though uncertain whether to offer tea or a reason to decline it. There was no need for preamble. Miss Marple merely laid the photograph on the table face up and waited. It took only a moment before the silence settled. Not the silence of resistance, but the weary kind that follows the end of a long-held vigil. "Yes," said Miss Price at last. "That's Beatrice." Her voice did not tremble. It was simply tired. "She served as a nurse near Brighton. Met him there. Gilbert. He was charming, attentive, and made her feel like she was someone. Not just a girl with neat handwriting and a hand for dressing wounds. She fell in love, and believed he had too." Miss Marple listened, not interrupting. "When she came home," Miss Price continued. She wasn't well. It wasn't consumption, and it wasn't nerves. She was expecting. The word hovered between them. In another village, perhaps it might have been spoken, with venom or shame. Here it was merely a fact, one that had altered the lives of 2 women irreversibly. He promised he'd return, but he married someone else. Beatrice never told anyone who the father was, not even Mother, only me. The child was born quietly and taken in by our aunt's cousin in Finchley. A girl. No formal adoption, just silence and a monthly parcel. Miss Marple closed her handbag slowly. She died 6 weeks later. There was no funeral, just a quiet burial and a story about her heart. Miss Price picked up the photo and looked at it. I sometimes think that baby might be walking through the world with her mother's eyes, never knowing. And as Miss Marple stood to leave, she understood that the story of Gilbert Waring's life was no longer confined to the past. It had stepped forward, breathing, and bore his name in secret. Miss Marple had never placed undue faith in coincidence. Patterns, yes. Recurrences. The quiet rhythm of human error, repeating itself through generations. But not coincidence. And as she sat beside her parlor window, the pieces now quietly in their places, she could no longer dismiss the unmistakable pattern that had emerged. The girl, Lydia Bell, had arrived in St. Mary Mead with a set of attributes that had seemed almost too delicately suited to Gilbert Waring's preferences. Soft-spoken, musically inclined, fond of gardens and long walks. A young woman with no surviving parents, reared in London by distant cousins, educated modestly, with a lingering sense of displacement she could never quite explain. Miss Marple, who had studied more than faces in her long life, who had, in fact, built her understanding of humanity upon subtleties of manner and gesture, had seen in Lydia something beyond mere resemblance. There was the quiet tilt of the head, the way she held her cup with her thumb tucked just so, the softness in her voice when speaking of things, lost rather than things desired. These were not learned behaviors. They were echoes. And now, knowing what she did, that Beatrice had borne a child in secret, and that child had been quietly passed into another household, Miss Marple felt that echo turn into a chime. Lydia had not come to St. Mary Mead by accident. She had come unknowingly toward a kind of inheritance, not of wealth, but of belonging. And Gilbert, whose affections had always followed a path of least resistance, had perhaps recognized her, or at the very least, suspected. The gifting of the photograph box, the sudden withdrawal of the engagement ring, the shift in his attentions, all signs of a man caught between desire and guilt. But he had left no confession, no written acknowledgement, only silence, and one last note in his pocket, recalling a kiss long before Lydia was born. Miss Marple folded her hands. The truth had returned, not with thunder, but in a whisper, and in its quiet revelation, she sensed that someone else already knew. The matter of the lockbox's reappearance was, on the surface, inexplicable. Yet Miss Marple had long believed that objects, like people, sometimes knew where they were meant to go. Lydia Bell, having withdrawn from village engagements and resumed her lessons in solitude, arrived one afternoon at Miss Marple's cottage, pale and clearly shaken. She carried with her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, her name written in faint ink on the corner. Inside it lay the very same lockbox that had been found days earlier behind the garden wall, the one containing the lilac blossom and Beatrice's photograph. "I found it in my suitcase," she said, the words caught between uncertainty and disbelief. "I don't know how it came to be there. I never packed it." Miss Marple received the statement without surprise. There were only a handful of individuals who might have had access to Lydia's belongings, and fewer still who would have known how to place such an item without notice. It had not been done hastily, nor was it intended to deceive. It was a gesture, one of intent, or perhaps restitution. To Miss Marple's mind, the box had been returned by someone who wanted Lydia to know. Not through confrontation, but through discovery. A quiet unveiling, a message without words. Lydia had recognized the woman in the photograph immediately. She did not know how, only that she had always imagined her mother looking precisely like that. Head turned, gaze distant, as though waiting for someone who might never arrive. What struck Miss Marple most, however, was Lydia's calm. There was no demand for explanation. Only the tremor of one who had long sensed a part of herself was missing, and now, through an old brass box and a dried blossom, had found its shape at last. The question that now stirred beneath this moment was no longer who Lydia was. It was who had placed the lockbox in her care, and what that person had hoped she might, or might not, do with what she found inside. Miss Marple had never believed that all letters were written to be read. Some were composed for the sake of the writer, a kind of reckoning of the heart, the act itself offering more solace than any reply ever could. It was with this understanding that she read the short note Lydia Bell had eventually entrusted to her care. The letter that had been found folded in Gilbert Waring's coat, the one that spoke of the kiss beneath the lilac tree. It was, as Miss Marple had suspected, not written by Beatrice Price, nor by one of Gilbert's long-forgotten paramours. It had been written by Lydia herself, penned in private following the discovery of the photograph, the blossom, and the unmistakable truth that her life had not begun in the way she had been told. In the letter, Lydia had described no accusations, no demands, only memory. Not her own, but imagined. A vision of a mother she had never met, and a man who, without knowing, had stood at the edge of that past, with the power to name it. The kiss beneath the lilac tree had not been her kiss, and yet it had shaped her. It had begun the chain of events that led years later to her being born into silence and raised in shadows. She had never intended for Gilbert to read the letter. It had been a private act, a way of setting the emotions stirred by the lockbox into some kind of order. She had written it in a moment of confusion and grief, tucked it away into a book of poetry, and thought no more of it. And yet, there it had been, in his coat on the day he died. The letter she never sent, found folded and worn at the edges, as though it had been carried for days. Miss Marple read the lines once more, and folded them carefully. The letter had changed nothing in its writing, and everything in its arrival. It was the detail that did not belong, the thing too convenient to be accidental. Miss Marple, having read the letter and understood its purpose, could not ignore the simple fact that it had made its way into Gilbert Waring's possession by a hand other than Lydia's own. Lydia herself had not posted it. She was quite clear on that point. The letter had remained inside a book, closed and forgotten, one of the many volumes on the shelf in her small cottage. And yet it had been removed, folded, and delivered to a man who, within a day of receiving it, had died. The realization, once it came, opened a quiet corridor of possibility. There had been, in Lydia's rooms, only one other person with access to her belongings in those days of confusion. One who had visited under the guise of sympathy, delivering soup and small cakes and asking questions that seemed too well rehearsed. Miss Price. Not as suspect, but as sister. Miss Marple had watched her closely in recent days, not for what she did, but what she avoided. Her absence from the funeral, her refusal to comment on Lydia's heritage, and most telling, her sudden change in posture whenever the subject of the letter was raised, as though she recognized its contents but dared not say so. Pressed gently, Miss Price had confessed to finding the letter. She had entered Lydia's cottage during an afternoon visit, seen the envelope poking from between the pages of a book, and, reading just enough to understand its significance, had taken it. She had meant to keep it safe, to ensure that Gilbert knew, not to stir scandal, but to bring truth to its rightful destination. "I thought he should know," she had said. "Before it was too late, I thought he should have the chance to make it right." But what she had not considered, what no one could have, was what the revelation might provoke. For if Gilbert had indeed read the letter, and if he had decided to act on it, there might be someone else who had not wished that to happen at all. There are confessions that arrive as cries, and there are those that unfold like the unpicking of a seam, quietly, stitch by stitch, until what was hidden lies bare beneath the light. Miss Price's admission fell into the latter category. She had not meant to betray Lydia. That, Miss Marple believed. It had not been the impulse of cruelty, nor the eagerness of gossip, but rather the slow, suffocating burden of a secret long held and never reconciled. The photograph had awakened it, the lockbox had confirmed it, and the letter had simply provided the means to speak aloud what had never been said. "I wanted him to know," Miss Price murmured, eyes fixed on the worn tabletop of her parlor. "I wanted him to face it, not for himself but for Beatrice." She had carried guilt not for her sister's death, which no one had prevented, but for her silence in the years that followed. She had seen what Beatrice had suffered, the shame, the illness, the grief buried behind a veil of fragility and propriety. And all the while, Gilbert Waring had gone on, dining, smiling, charming, untouched. Miss Marple had not judged her. She merely listened, as she always did. Regret, she knew, was rarely logical. It bloomed in curious places, often decades after its seed was planted. That Miss Price had sent the letter, believing it might force Gilbert to reckon with his past, was not in itself a crime. But consequences, in village life, are rarely measured by intent alone. And now, Gilbert was dead. The question, then, was not whether the letter had prompted a revelation. It was whether that revelation had prompted someone else, someone watching closely, to act. For secrets can survive in shadows. But once exposed, they cast long, unfamiliar light. And there, in that light, Miss Marple began to consider the bruise once more. Not as a side note to tragedy, but as its quiet signature. It had been remarked upon early, a slight mark behind Gilbert Waring's ear. At the time it had been attributed to a fall, a fainting spell, the way a man collapses when his heart fails him unexpectedly. But Miss Marple had always kept the detail tucked away, unsatisfied with the ease of that explanation. Now, with the discovery of the digitalis, the timing of the letter, and the shift in household loyalties, the bruise returned to her mind not as an accident, but as evidence. For there are bruises caused by happenstance, and those left by resistance. Miss Marple recalled the doctor's phrasing. The poison would have dissolved easily in wine or tea, particularly with sugar. But Gilbert had been known to take his evening wine unsweetened. More to the point, he had been in perfect health. Why would he have taken medicine he neither needed nor recognized? There was, then, a likelihood far more sinister, that the digitalis had not been consumed willingly, but administered. She considered the nature of such an act. It would have required proximity, calm, intimacy even. Someone close enough to offer a drink, and determined enough to ensure it was swallowed. The bruise, small and round, matched not the edge of furniture nor the casual impact of a fall, but the shape of a glass stem, pressed in panic or purpose, a hand held too tightly to a jaw, a wrist that did not release until it was done. It was not the act of a monster. Miss Marple never thought in such terms. It was the act of someone who believed they had been cornered, overlooked, or replaced. Someone not merely threatened by the letter, but terrified of what it signified. A change in loyalty, in legacy, in love. The poison had not been chosen for its speed, but for its subtlety. It mirrored the act itself, quiet, precise, personal. And though the bruise would fade in time, Miss Marple knew what it revealed would not. It spoke not only of murder, but of motive, and pointed unerringly to the one person who had always stood just close enough. It had always been Miss Marple's view that tea, properly served, could soften even the harshest of revelations. It encouraged restraint, slowed tempers, and gave the appearance, even during moments of great discomfort, of civility. That was why, when she invited a select group of individuals to join her that afternoon, no one questioned her intentions. They merely arrived, punctual and lightly curious, each with their own assumptions of why they had been summoned. There were no speeches, no accusations, merely teacups, barely sweetened, and plates of buttered scones arranged with unspoken formality. Mrs. Edgecombe came with her usual elegance, offering polite thanks, and occupying her seat with the cool detachment of one rehearsing her disinterest. Lydia Bell arrived hesitantly, her presence tentative, as though uncertain if she were guest or witness. Mr. Malcolm Trent, ever cautious, watched everyone from behind steepled fingers, a man unaccustomed to company he could not control. And finally there was Mrs. Rudge, quiet, grave, her apron neatly folded, her gaze lowered, as though already aware of the question waiting to be asked. Miss Marple poured the tea and made small observations about the weather and the early blooming of the camellias. She asked after Lydia's music and Mrs. Edgecombe's dahlias. She inquired about Mr. Trent's nephew, newly posted in the north. To an outsider it might have seemed a harmless gathering, bound by manners and sponge cake. But beneath the surface, the arrangement was surgical. Each guest had been placed with precision, not to provoke, but to observe. Miss Marple noted the tightening of fingers around porcelain, the delayed sips, the moments when a remark landed too close to truth and silence fell heavier than usual. She observed glances not exchanged, words not spoken, and the way Mrs. Rudge flinched when Lydia mentioned the lockbox, though no one had said it had ever been in her possession. The stage, though quiet, had been set, and now, like a seamstress preparing to unpick a hem, Miss Marple reached for the first thread of truth, knowing it would not take long for the rest to follow. It was not in Miss Marple's nature to deliver declarations. She had always preferred the gentle presentation of facts, a laying out of evidence like a set of fine handkerchiefs, folded carefully, each bearing its own faint trace of use. And so it was, with teacups still warm and conversation suspended in delicate stillness, that she began. She spoke first of the bruise, so small, and yet so telling. It had been behind Gilbert Waring's left ear, and dismissed as incidental. But it was not. It was, Miss Marple explained, the kind of mark left when a glass is pressed too hard to the lips of someone reluctant to drink. The digitalis, taken in fatal quantity, had not been swallowed willingly. Then came the matter of the missing bottle, Mr. Trent's old prescription, absent from his drawer. A curious coincidence, some might say. But Miss Marple had noted his annoyance more than his concern, which suggested knowledge. not surprise. Next, the letter. Written by Lydia, yes, but never posted. And yet it had arrived in Gilbert's pocket, having passed through the hands of Miss Price. A gesture of justice, she claimed, not vengeance. But the gesture had altered the course of things. It had revealed what Gilbert had long concealed, that he had fathered a child, and that child now stood before them, entirely unaware of the danger her presence had awoken. Miss Marple then turned her gaze, kindly but with unmistakable clarity, to Mrs. Rudge. She had been in the house that night. She had poured the wine. She had taken the tray away. She had also known Mrs. Waring, deeply, perhaps privately. There had been something possessive in her grief, something territorial in her silence. And now, faced with the truth that Gilbert had intended to name Lydia in his new will, to recognize her, perhaps to legitimize her, she had acted. The photo box had vanished, then reappeared. The wine had been poured, and someone had made sure it was drunk. The room was still. No one interrupted, and Miss Marple, in her usual gentle tone, concluded. It was not done out of hatred but fear of being forgotten, replaced. And that, she knew, was a motive stronger than most. There are forms of love that refuse to name themselves. Love that binds in silence, that watches from corners, that wears the habit of loyalty so tightly it begins to chafe against the skin. In Mrs. Rudge, Miss Marple had long recognized such a love. Not the romantic kind, but one forged in obligation, admiration, and something deeper, something that hardened into resentment when never fully returned. Mrs. Rudge had been with the Waring household since the early days. She had served Mrs. Waring with quiet deference and a care that extended beyond duty, and after the lady's death she had remained, not out of necessity, but out of something more unspoken. It was a form of devotion, preserved in dusting routines and the precise folding of linen, in the way she refused to let anyone else polish the late mistress's silver comb. Miss Marple had seen it before, not often, but memorably. That peculiar devotion some women held for other women, fierce, quiet, unclaimed. When Gilbert Waring turned his attentions elsewhere, first to fleeting village companionships, and then more recently, to Lydia Bell, something within Mrs. Rudge had changed. And when the letter arrived, when the truth of Lydia's parentage, and the implication that Gilbert meant to make amends, became evident, the unraveling had begun. She would have watched him reading it. She would have known what it meant, that the girl, born of another, would now inherit not just affection, but perhaps the very home she herself had tended for decades. That the name of the first Mrs. Waring, the one she had honored in silence, would be buried beneath the arrival of a stranger claiming blood. Miss Marple, with no triumph in her voice, laid it bare before the tea-table. Mrs. Rudge had not hated Lydia. She had simply feared being erased. The murder had not been cold. It had been deeply human. Mrs. Rudge sat still, her eyes dry, her face unreadable. And it was in that stillness, not resistance, not denial, that Miss Marple saw what she had always known, that nothing wounds so deeply as a love that dares not speak its name. It was, in the end, a detail so small, it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Miss Marple had made a lifelong habit of watching hands. Not the grand gestures, but the idle habits. How fingers tapped when anxious, how palms clenched when lying, how gloves were worn by those who needed to guard their presence or hide their prints. Mrs. Rudge, for all her efficiency, had a fastidiousness that bordered on ritual. She wore gloves to scrub the parlor tiles, gloves to polish silver, gloves to prepare the morning tea, thin, tight-fitting, barely colored. the sort that prevented the oils of the skin from leaving any trace on the surfaces she was trusted to preserve. And yet, the day the lockbox was recovered, it bore the faintest sign of handling, a smudge on the brass latch, the shape of an index finger not quite wiped away. The box had been hidden behind a loose brick in the garden wall, a task requiring precision, strength, and one would assume, care. It had not been placed there by accident. Miss Marple had said nothing at the time, merely noted the absence of gloves when Mrs. Rudge had appeared at the vicarage the following morning, her hands bare, her knuckles chapped, as though scrubbed in haste. No one else had noticed. No one else had reason to think it strange. But to Miss Marple, it had been the final, unspoken admission. The gloves had not been worn, because in the moment the poison was administered, and again when the evidence was hidden, they had been forgotten. Rage, grief, or some mixture of the two had overridden habit. And when the box reappeared in Lydia's possession, it had been clean, too clean, polished in the way only someone who knew every grain of the household silver would bother to do, wiped not just to remove dust, but to remove remorse. But one smudge had remained, not enough to convict, but enough to confirm. Miss Marple looked once more at the hands folded in Mrs. Rudge's lap, hands that had preserved a house for a woman now long gone, and had destroyed a man whose memory had threatened her place in it. Truth, like fingerprints, may be faint, but it lingers. And this one, though smoothed by silence, could not be rubbed away. Spring returned to Saint, Mary Mead with its usual modest beauty, the hedgerows trimmed, the grass damp with morning dew, and the scent of wisteria lingering in the air just long enough to be noticed. But this year something had been added, or rather, restored. Behind the vicarage fence, at the spot where the original had once bloomed decades ago, a young lilac tree had been planted. The earth around it was freshly turned, the trunk slim and fragile, its buds still tightly folded. It had not flowered yet. It would not, perhaps, for another year. But its presence was enough. Miss Marple, who had quietly suggested the idea to the vicar's wife under the guise of rebalancing the garden's composition, watched with quiet satisfaction as the roots took hold. There was no plaque, no fanfare, only a shared understanding among a few that the tree belonged where it stood, not only as a nod to the past, but as a gesture of quiet remembrance. Lydia Bell had visited it once already. She had said nothing upon seeing it, merely placed her gloved hand briefly on the trunk, as though steadying herself. She did not know all of her mother's story, but she knew enough to reclaim something long denied her. The villagers spoke of the tree as a nice touch, a sentimental addition to the old garden's charm. But for those who had followed the quiet unfolding of events, who had seen the way old truths can be planted and left to bloom in their own time, it was more than sentiment. Miss Marple never spoke of the case again. There was no need. The authorities had been informed. Mrs. Rudge had been taken away without resistance. The newspapers, ever starved for novelty, mentioned the affair once before, returning to matters of greater scandal. But the lilac tree remained, not as evidence, nor even as tribute, but as a reminder that even the softest things, when planted with care, can outlive silence. There were many ways to honor the past, but Miss Marple had always believed the quietest were often the most enduring. Not long after the funeral, and the final questions had settled into that peculiar hush that follows a village scandal, Lydia Bell placed a small photograph on the windowsill of her parlor. It was unframed at first, resting against a vase of daffodils, the corners slightly curled with age. Later she had it mounted in a thin silver frame, nothing ornate, just enough to give it permanence. The photograph was of a young woman in a nurse's uniform. Her expression was poised, though not quite smiling, and her eyes were turned to one side, as though caught in thought or memory. It was Beatrice. Lydia had not asked permission. There was no one from whom she needed it now. The photograph had been hers by right, even before she had known it existed. Now it faced the sunlight each morning, casting a faint shadow on the sill, one that lengthened and shortened with the hours, like a sundial keeping gentle time. She had not changed her name, nor left the village. She had no inheritance to claim, and none was offered. But she had been given something else, a truth that did not demand justice or apology, only acknowledgement. And sometimes, Miss Marple thought, that was the rarest gift of all. A face in the frame, a window filled with morning light. No need for declarations. Lydia had found what had long eluded her, a sense of place, of belonging. She no longer searched faces in crowds or traced the shape of her chin in mirrors. She had her mother now, and that, Miss Marple knew, was enough. Miss Marple, as she did each year in early April, spent the morning pruning her roses. It was a task she cherished. Not for the horticultural satisfaction, but for the thinking it allowed. Gardens, after all, were places of silence, and silence was where truth often waited to be heard. She thought of Gilbert Waring, and of all the lives that had quietly orbited his. Lydia, Miss Price, Beatrice, Mrs. Rudge. Each had carried a different version of him in their memory, and each had been shaped, for better or worse, by what he gave or withheld. Some would remember him as charming, others as cruel, and both, she suspected, would be correct. Miss Marple did not believe in tidy endings. She knew that human nature rarely allowed for such convenience. But she did believe in balance, that, with time, what had been buried might be gently unearthed, and what had gone unspoken might finally find voice. The village had returned to its rhythms. Bunting was being considered for the May fete. Mrs. Bantry had taken up her bird-watching again. Even Miss Price, now quieter than before, had begun mending garments once more. The scandal had passed as they always did, not forgotten, but folded neatly into the fabric of the place. As she clipped the last bloom, Miss Marple paused to brush a petal from her sleeve, and glanced toward the fence line where the lilac had been planted. It would flower soon, not for her perhaps, but for someone younger, someone still learning that ghosts, when properly acknowledged, need not haunt. Some ghosts linger not to torment, but to be remembered. She thought then of Gilbert's final words to her, spoken days before his death over a shared tea. "There's something beautiful I have left too long in the dark." It had not been a confession, merely a thought, offered like the hint of a blossom in early spring. Now, with truth restored and the past made known, Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Not all wounds need to scar. Some, if given light and time, may simply bloom. And so, dear listener, another quiet corner of St. Mary Mead yields its secrets. Not with noise, but with a whisper. A letter never meant to be posted, a bruise never meant to be noticed, and a love never meant to be spoken. These were the threads that Miss Marple followed with her usual quiet brilliance. In the end, it wasn't hatred that drove the final act, but something more fragile. A fear of being forgotten, a desperate attempt to hold on to a place in a world that was moving on. We often think of murder as born of violence, but as Miss Marple has shown us time and again, the heart is far more dangerous when it breaks silently. The garden blooms again, the lilac tree takes root once more, and a daughter finds her mother not through inheritance, but through truth, gently unearthed, and finally, lovingly honored. But here's a question for you. If you had found that letter, the one Lydia never meant to send, would you have delivered it to Gilbert? Or would you have left the past undisturbed? Let us know in the comments. We truly love hearing your thoughts, and your answers help others discover these mysteries too. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a question, or simply a love for well-planted clues, we invite you to share it with someone who enjoys classic tales of suspense and human nature. And don't forget to subscribe for more Miss Marple-style mysteries, where the answers always lie not in the facts, but in the feelings. Until next time, thank you for joining us. And remember, not all ghosts wear sheets. Some wear smiles.